On June 22nd, the US launched an airstrike that devastated Iran's nuclear facilities. Dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer, the strike used powerful bunker-busting bombs capable of penetrating deep underground before releasing their explosive payloads. The strike was a success. 3 Iranian nuclear sites, Fordow, Isfahan, and Natanz, were hit hard. However, a US general has revealed that there was far more to these strikes than nobody else knew. This is everything you didn't know about the bunker buster strikes on Iran. But first, a recap. Operation Midnight Hammer saw the US drop a massive 14 of its GBU-57B massive ordnance penetrator bombs on a trio of nuclear sites in Iran. Fordow was the main target. 12 of the American bombs touched down on that site, which is buried deep underground. Another 2 hit Natanz, hitting an underground portion of the facility. As for Isfahan, it managed to avoid the bunker busters, though it was still hit hard by Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from a US Navy submarine. You can learn more about the details of Operation Midnight Hammer in our video, which covered every aspect of the attack that was known soon after June 22nd. We also know a good amount about the GBU-57. According to Army Recognition, America's bunker-busting bomb is a precision-guided, deep penetration bomb that was designed and developed by Boeing for the US Air Force. It's made specifically to defeat targets buried deep underground and is believed to be the most powerful non-nuclear bomb in the current US inventory. The bomb weighs 30,000 pounds, measures 20.3 feet in length, and has a diameter of 31.5 inches. The warhead ranges in between 4,590 and 5,732 pounds, depending on the variant of the bomb used, and the only aircraft capable of dropping the GBU-57 is the US-made and operated B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. A single GBU-57 is capable of penetrating up to 200 feet and can blast through reinforced concrete or rock before delivering its explosive payload. The weapon is also accurate with a circular error probability of just a few feet. Oh, and Operation Midnight Hammer was the first time the US deployed this powerful weapon. So that's what we know. What about what we didn't know? That information comes from US Air Force General Dan Raisin Kane, who the Warzone or TWZ says spoke extensively about precisely what the US pulled off with its weekend attacks against Iran's nuclear facilities. During his speech, Kane delivered some key details, both about the GBU-57 and the strikes themselves, that hadn't been made fully available to the public up until this point. The first revelation, the GBU-57s the US dropped used a special smart fuse to ensure they hit their targets. According to Kane, each of these bombs had their fuse programmed bespokely, TWZ reports, which allows each weapon to achieve a particular effect inside the target. Kane added that each of the 12 bombs dropped on Fordow has a unique desired impact angle, arrival, and final heading. This is important information because it tells us that the US put far more thought into Operation Midnight Hammer than simply sending B-2s to Iran to drop bombs on a vague underground location. Each of the GBU-57s dropped had a specific purpose, whether that was serving as an initial penetrator or causing the bulk of the damage once earlier bombs had created a route down into the heart of the Fordow facility. As for the smart fuses the bombs used, these may have been the same fuses upon which TWZ reported in February 2025. It was revealed in that month that the US Air Force had been quietly working on a handful of small problems that hindered how well the GBU-57 integrated into its primary deployment platform, the B-2 bomber. Among the tweaks made, TWZ says, was the creation and testing of a new smart fuse intended to improve the GBU-57's effectiveness. That fuse would be so smart that it would ensure the GBU-57 hits its target even in cases when the exact depth and positioning of that target isn't known. The update came from the Director Operational Test and Evaluation or DTRA 2024 annual report, which said, "The Air Force conducted 2 full-scale tests in FY24 to verify fixes to a B-2 integration issue. The second of the 2 full-scale test events also used the LPSF Large Penetrator Smart Fuse in a full-scale testbed. Those tests followed the development of a program in 2018 designed to address what the report calls the urgent operational need to integrate a smart fuse into the GBU-57. The tests were successful, and as we now know, we just saw how important these new smart fuses were to the success of the US strikes against Iran." Kane continued. After explaining the purpose of the smart fuses, the US general also revealed that Iran had done everything it could to protect Fordow before the launch of Operation Midnight Hammer. Key to those preparations were protecting a pair of ventilation shafts that were the B-2 bomber's key target during the strike. In the days preceding the attack against Fordow, the Iranians attempted to cover the shafts with concrete to try to prevent an attack, Kane said. "I won't share the specific dimensions of the concrete cap, But you should know that we know what the dimensions of those concrete caps were. The planners had to account for this. They accounted for everything. Satellite images shared by TWZ on June 23rd, which showed the Fordow site days before the US carried out its strikes, suggested that Iran had been using concrete to try to guard the site. One of the images, captured on June 19th by Maxar Technologies, shows a large row of trucks that is now believed were carrying concrete to Fordow to plug up the ventilation shafts. Visible activity at the site was also recorded on June 20th, with more trucks moving in and out of Fordow. As TWZ's Tyler Roggaway noted in a post on X, many believe that Iran was using these trucks to transport enriched uranium away from Fordow. That now seems to have not been the case. Roggaway asked the key question on June 23rd. Or were they filling the entrances with dirt so a ground operation could not penetrate it? Now Kane seems to have given us the answer. Though we don't know how thick the concrete caps Iran created were, we do know that they didn't stop the US from targeting Fordow's ventilation shafts. Speaking to Australia's ABC News, Jonathan Hare of ABC's Verify team explains why these shafts were targeted. He notes that experts from the Institute for Science and International Security believe each ventilation shaft is kind of a vulnerability within this complex's system. They've known that ventilation shaft is there for a long time because they've seen these blueprints that were stolen. What does all of this mean? The US knew everything. It already knew where the ventilation shafts were long before it struck Iran's supposedly secret underground nuclear facility. It watched as Iran tried to protect those shafts by filling them up with concrete. And even with that concrete in place, the US also knew that Iran had done nowhere near enough to stop its powerful bunker busters from hitting their targets. And that brings us to the next thing we learned about Operation Midnight Hammer. Thanks to Kane, the US was very intelligent in how it deployed its GBU-57s. The cap was forcibly removed by the first weapon, and the main shaft was uncovered. Weapons 2, 3, 4, and 5 were tasked to enter the main shaft, move down into the complex at greater than 1,000 feet per second, and explode in the mission space. In other words, the US had a plan for Iran's concrete caps almost as soon as Iran put them in place. Each ventilation shaft was targeted with 6 bombs, with the first used on each shaft being designed to decimate the concrete caps. Iran would have hoped that it would be the end of the US strike. It wasn't. Follow-up bombs then entered the main ventilation shaft, with each penetrating deeper than the one that came before to destroy the Fordow underground facility. The US even had a backup plan, which is where the 6th bomb in each strike group came into play. Each of those final bombs was designed as a flex weapon to allow us to cover if one of the preceding jets or one of the preceding weapons didn't work. The sheer scale of the planning that went into the Fordow strike shows us that the US covered every possible base. And the result was simple. Every single GBU-57 struck its target. As Kane continues, all 6 weapons at each vent at Fordow went exactly where they were intended to go. A bomb has 3 effects that can cause damage: blast, fragmentation, and overpressure. In this case, the primary kill mechanism in the mission space was a mix of overpressure and blast, ripping through the open tunnels and destroying critical hardware. The majority of the damage we assess, based on our extensive modeling, was a blast layer combined with the impulse extending from the shock. It's obvious what the role blasts would have played in destroying the Fordow nuclear site. However, it's worth digging a little deeper into what Kane calls overpressure. According to the US Army Combat Readiness Center, overpressure is a particularly damaging and often under-recognized effect of explosions, as noted by US Army safety literature. Overpressure is measured in pounds per square inch, or PSI, and it refers to the rapid wave of high pressure that is blown outward from an explosion's center. That pressure, when utilized correctly, is capable of having a devastating impact on the surrounding environment, causing as much damage as the explosion itself. In the case of Operation Midnight Hammer, overpressure likely caused as much damage to Fordow as the GBU-57 explosions. The Combat Readiness Center notes that a blast that produces just 1 psi of overpressure is enough to shatter windows. If the blast produces overpressure of 5 psi or higher, it can destroy concrete walls and cause injuries in humans ranging from rupture of the lungs, eyes, and gastrointestinal tract to brain compression and bodily tissue damage. Overpressure was key to everything in the Fordow bombing. However, we don't know specifically how much overpressure a GBU-57 creates. Still, this is a 30,000-pound bomb. That means we can safely assume it produces more than the 5 psi that can cause damage to concrete structures. At that level, the GBU-57 would have created the equivalent of a 163 mph wind inside Fordow, according to the Atomic Archive. If the GBU-57 generates overpressure of 10 psi, that amounts to winds of 294 mph that are enough to severely damage reinforced concrete buildings and kill almost anybody caught up in them. At 20 psi, the wind speed increases to 502 mph and becomes strong enough to take out even heavily built concrete structures. Kane's message is simple here. If it wasn't the blasts that destroyed Fordow, it was the massive wave of wind the GBU-57s generated. Still, one thing we don't know is just how much damage Operation Midnight Hammer caused. We can speculate, as we will later in the video, but Kane was quick to point out that the joint forces responsible for launching the strike aren't responsible for determining its effectiveness. What they do determine is whether the bombs hit their intended targets. They all did, as Kane explained. A point that I want to make here, the joint forces do not do BDA, bomb damage assessment. By design, we don't grade our own homework. The intelligence community does. But here's what we know following the attacks and strikes on Fordow. First, the weapons were built, tested, and loaded properly. 2. The weapons were released on speed and on parameters. 3. The weapons all guided to their intended targets and to their intended aim points. 4. The weapons functioned as designed, meaning they exploded. Everything happened exactly how the US intended. It dropped multiple GBU-57s on 2 ventilation shafts, employing a drill-down strategy to ensure the bunker busters penetrated their targets. Once there, the bombs exploded as anticipated, and Fordow was hit hard. And that was the entire point. Because, as Kane reveals, the GBU-57 wasn't just developed because the US needed a bunker buster. It was made specifically because the US knew about Fordow years ago and decided that it needed to have a bomb capable of striking the facility if Iran ever got too close to building a nuclear weapon. There's an organization in the US called the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA. DTRA does a lot of things for our nation, but DTRA is the world's leading expert on deeply buried underground targets, Kane said when talking about the GBU-57. In 2009, a Defense Threat Reduction Agency officer was brought into a vault at an undisclosed location and briefed on something going on in Iran for security purposes. I'm not going to share his name. Though Kane was secretive about the officer, he did reveal that the officer was shown photographs and received intelligence about what looked like a major construction project taking place inside the mountains of Iran. At the time, the US may not have known what they were seeing was set to become a uranium enrichment facility, but that officer, along with his DTRA colleagues, watched and waited. For more than 15 years, this officer and his teammate lived and breathed this single target, Fordow, a critical element of Iran's covert nuclear weapons program. He studied the geology, he watched the Iranians dig it out, he watched the construction, the weather, the discard material, the geology, the construction materials, where the materials came from. He looked at the vent shaft, the exhaust shaft, the electrical systems, the environmental control systems, every nook, every crater, every piece of equipment going in and every piece of equipment going out, Kane said. They literally dreamed about this target at night when they slept. They thought about it driving back and forth to work, and they knew from the very first days what this was for. You do not build a multi-layered underground bunker complex with centrifuges and other equipment in a mountain for any peaceful purpose. All of that study led the US to the realization that it needed a weapon specifically designed to take out this new underground facility. The GBU-57 was chosen as the ideal candidate. As TWZ notes, America's massive bunker buster was already under development before the Fordow plans were revealed in 2009. However, it was then part of a much larger and more generalized hard target defeat program. Once the plans for Fordow were revealed, the US started making tweaks to the GBU-57 to ensure it was capable of hitting the facility if needed. There's a clear logic here. At the time, Fordow was the most important target a bunker buster could hit. It was also one of the deepest. According to Scientific American, Fordow is located about 18 miles northeast of the Iranian city of Qom. It's also buried deep, with its main facilities being anywhere between 260 and 300 feet underground. Plenty of bunker busters had already been built by 2009. Even Israel had some, including a 5,000-pound bomb. The problem was that none of these bunker busters could penetrate deep enough to hit Fordow. On its own, a single GBU-57 couldn't either. It could get close, though it would be at least 60 feet shy of Fordow's underground buildings. But several GBU-57s, all launched with pinpoint precision at the same target one after the other, they could penetrate. They could destroy Fordow. With the GBU-57, the US developed a Fordow killer that now also stands as the most powerful bunker buster in the world. Therein lies the logic. If you have a bomb that can take out the deepest threat you've identified, you also have a bomb that can hit practically any other underground target you might need to hit in the future. Finally, Kane revealed that the GBU-57 was tested extensively before it was used against Fordow. They tested it, the MOP, over and over again, tried different options, tried more after that. They accomplished hundreds of test shots and dropped many full-scale weapons against extremely realistic targets for a single purpose: kill this target at the time and place of our nation's choosing, said Kane. OSINT researcher Fabian Heinz revealed another interesting fact about those tests, noting that they took place just 18.6 miles away from the New Mexico site where the US tested the first ever nuclear bomb. He noted that 3 sites were used to test the GBU-57, all in a location named White Sands. By 2022, 2 clearly defined craterless holes had appeared at the top of the facility, roughly 80 meters above the entrance level if Google Earth is to be believed, Heinz posted to X. A test run for Fordow? There's not enough evidence to prove it conclusively, but there is enough data to support the idea that the Detra-run underground facilities at White Sands have played a major role in MOP testing and development. Again, this all feeds into the new narrative surrounding the GBU-57. It was made specifically to hit Fordow, and the US has been testing and practicing for years to pull off Operation Midnight Hammer. On June 22nd, it followed through on all of that practice. But how effective was the strike? That's the only question that Kane didn't answer, though there are suggestions that the attack on Fordow, although successful from an operational standpoint, may not have been as effective as the US hoped. It all comes down to the enriched uranium stored at Fordow. On June 25th, NBC News reported that several leaks have cast the success of Operation Midnight Hammer under doubt. One of the leaks came from an anonymous source who spoke to NBC and said, "We were assuming that the damage was going to be much more significant than this assessment is finding. This assessment is already finding that these core pieces are still intact. That's a bad sign for the overall program. Those core pieces not being destroyed would mean that Operation Midnight Hammer might have only set the Iranian nuclear program back by a couple of months, rather than ending it altogether." Furthermore, US Vice President J.D. Vance was somewhat elusive when asked about the operation on June 24th. Rather than confirming that the US had destroyed the stockpiles of 60% enriched uranium held at Fordow and Iran's other nuclear sites, he focused on the US destroying Iran's capacity to enrich that uranium to the 90% needed to create a nuclear warhead. "I think that part of the mission has been accomplished," Vance said. "Stocks of enriched uranium are one of them. I wish those stocks were buried, but our understanding is that some of them were taken away by Iran, and we don't know where they are." However, that statement was later contradicted by US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who said on June 26th that he was unaware of any intelligence that suggests Iran managed to move its uranium before the bunker busters struck. It's clear that more assessments need to be carried out. But we now know more about Operation Midnight Hammer and the weapons used to carry it out than ever before. The US planned for a strike on Fordow for years before it happened. It built a weapon specifically for that strike, and that weapon was being tweaked less than a year before Operation Midnight Hammer happened. Most importantly, the US sent a message to all of its enemies on June 22nd. The GBU-57 works, and it hits harder than you could have imagined. We also know that Iran has nowhere left to turn after the operation. It's at a dead end, economically, militarily, and when it comes to its nuclear program, that will soon force it to the negotiating table. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in Operation Midnight Hammer and the conflict in Iran.